Sit down, get comfortable, and know your place while you're at it. That's what the young public defender said to the older woman sitting in the front row of Courtroom 4, folder in her lap, reading glasses pushed up on her head. He said it without looking at her twice. He said it the way men say things to women they've already decided don't matter. Her name was Corinne Ashby. She was 68 years old. She had been sitting in that courtroom for 11 minutes, waiting for her grandson's arraignment to begin, and she had not said a single word to anyone. The public defender, a 29-year-old named Preston who had been assigned to her grandson's case 40 minutes earlier and had not yet read the file, assumed she was exactly what she looked like: an anxious grandmother in a cardigan, out of her depth, in the way. He was wrong about all three things. Corinne Ashby had spent 19 years on the federal bench. She had retired 2 years ago, and she had recognized the presiding judge the moment she walked in, because she was the one who had sworn him in. Preston did not know any of this yet. He was about to find out in front of a full docket, a court reporter, and a judge who was going to have to explain, on the record, why he had let a case get this far without anyone noticing what was actually happening in his courtroom. Corinne had not come to watch. She had come because her grandson had called her at 11 at night, scared and 17, and assigned a lawyer who had spent 4 minutes with him before the hearing. She had put on her good coat, and she had come to sit quietly and see for herself before she decided what she was going to do about it. She was about to decide. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Preston leaned toward her while the clerk called the previous case, and he explained, in the flat, rushed voice of a man managing a caseload he could not actually manage, that the best move for her grandson was to take the plea. 18 months, he said, reduced from the original charge, better than rolling the dice with a jury in this county. Corinne asked him a single question. She asked whether he had read the arresting officer's report in full. Preston said he had reviewed the file. He had not. He had skimmed the summary page during the elevator ride up. He told her, in the tone people use on relatives they consider well-meaning but unqualified, that he understood this was hard to hear, but that she should trust the process. Corinne nodded once. She opened her folder. She had brought her own copy of the report, requested through channels Preston did not know existed 3 days earlier. To understand what Corinne was about to do in that courtroom, you have to understand what had already been taken from her once, decades earlier, in a much smaller room with much lower stakes and no one watching at all. Her father had worked 41 years as a Pullman porter out of Union Station, carrying bags for men who would not learn his name in a single one of those 41 years. He had come home every night with his back sore and his uniform pressed, because he had told Corinne when she was small that a man could not control how the world treated him, but he could control whether he let it change how he treated himself. Her mother had taken in sewing from 3 families on the good side of town, working at a machine wedged into the corner of a kitchen too small for it, and she had taught Corinne, stitch by stitch, that carelessness always shows eventually, no matter how fast you finish the seam. They had saved for 11 years to send her to college. They had never once suggested she choose something smaller. Corinne had been one of 4 women in her law school class in 1979. She had been mistaken, in her first decade of practice, for a secretary, a translator, and once memorably, for the defendant's mother during her own closing argument, an error the judge had not bothered to correct until she had finished speaking. She had built her career on the same principle her mother had taught her at that sewing machine. She did the work carefully, every time, whether or not anyone was watching. She let the carelessness of others reveal itself in its own time, because she had learned that a room leans in further for a woman who stays quiet and prepared than for one who raises her voice to be believed. There was one case, early in her career, that she had never stopped thinking about. She had been 26 years old, a junior associate at a firm that mostly handled corporate work, taking a pro bono case because no one senior wanted it. A 16-year-old boy named Marcus, accused of a robbery he said he hadn't committed, assigned a public defender who had 40 other cases that same week and had not read a single line of the file before advising him to plead. Corinne had come in too late to change the outcome. She had watched the boy take 18 months for something the evidence, when she finally reviewed it years later out of guilt, did not clearly support. She had lost track of him after his release. She did not know, that morning in Courtroom 4, that she was about to find out what had happened to him, and that the answer would matter more than anything else that would happen that day. The judge called the case. He looked up from the docket, and his eyes moved past Preston, past the prosecutor, and landed on Corinne in the gallery. His expression did something careful and complicated. His name was Judge Alan Whitfield. He had clerked for Corinne 9 years earlier, in her final term on the federal bench, and he had learned more in that single year than in the 3 years of law school that preceded it. He had been sworn into this very bench in this very building by her hand. "Judge Ashby," he said, before he could stop himself, and the room turned all at once, toward the woman in the cardigan in the front row. Preston's face went through the specific sequence of a man recalculating everything he had said in the last 4 minutes. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman named Renata who had been quietly unimpressed with Preston's preparation all morning, sat up straighter. The court reporter's fingers paused over her keys for the first time all morning. Corinne stood, folder in hand, and asked the court's permission to be heard, not as family, but as an officer of the court appearing amicus curiae. It was, she said, a request she did not make lightly, and one she would explain fully if the court would permit it. Whitfield granted it. He had not seen his former judge in 2 years. He had followed her career at a respectful distance the way clerks often do, hearing occasional updates through the small, tight network of people who had once sat in her chambers. He did not yet know why she was here, in his courtroom, on a Tuesday morning, in a case that had nothing to do with her professionally. He was about to find out that it had everything to do with a boy she had failed to help 30 years earlier, and a system she had spent her retirement quietly investigating in ways no one, including her own family, fully understood yet. Corinne did not open with accusations. She opened with a question, because she had learned decades earlier that a courtroom remembers questions longer than it remembers statements. She asked Judge Whitfield whether he would permit her to enter into the record a document she had obtained through a public records request filed 8 days prior. Whitfield asked what the document was. Corinne told him. It was a staffing audit, commissioned by the County Bar Association 18 months earlier, examining caseloads across the public defender's office. The audit had concluded that any attorney carrying more than 60 active cases could not reasonably provide constitutionally adequate representation. The audit had also concluded, in a section buried on its 14th page, that the average caseload in this county's office currently stood at 131. The report had been submitted to the county commission. It had been filed. It had never been discussed publicly, and no funding had been allocated in response to it. Preston did not know this report existed. He had started at the public defender's office 11 months earlier, 3 weeks out of a public interest fellowship that had made him believe, with the particular sincerity of a young man who has not yet been ground down by a system he does not control, that he could do meaningful work inside a broken structure through sheer effort alone. He had been assigned 40 cases his first month. He now carried 142. He had stopped somewhere around case number 90, being able to remember which client belonged to which file without checking. He was not lazy. He was not careless in the way people are careless when they do not care. He was careless in the specific, exhausted way that people become careless when the math of their job has simply stopped working, and no one above him had been willing to say so out loud. Corinne knew this because she had spent the better part of her retirement studying it. 2 years after leaving the bench, she had joined the board of a nonprofit that tracked public defender workloads across the state, work she had taken on quietly without press releases, because she had told her husband before he passed that the work that mattered most was rarely the work anyone photographed. She had reviewed 9 county reports in 18 months. She had flagged 3 offices to state oversight boards. She had done all of this without her own grandson, knowing that his grandmother, the woman who made him oatmeal on Saturday mornings, had spent her Tuesdays reading 500-page staffing audits at her kitchen table with the same care her mother had once given a hemline. She had not planned to bring any of this into her grandson's case. She had planned only to sit quietly, watch, and decide later whether intervention was warranted. Preston's comment in the hallway, delivered without malice but with the total unthinking certainty of a man who had already decided what kind of woman she was, had simply confirmed what the file already told her. This was not a single failure. It was a pattern with her grandson's name currently caught inside it, and she was not going to let that pattern run its course a second time in her own family. Not after the first time it had run its course through a boy named Marcus 30 years earlier. She said his name into the record without planning to. Marcus Doyle, she said, 16 years old at the time, a case she had taken pro bono in 1994, a public defender carrying 40 cases who had advised a plea in 11 minutes of total consultation. She said that she had lost that case, that she had watched a boy who likely had a viable defense accept 18 months because no one had given him the time his case required. She said that she had spent 30 years wondering what became of him. She did not know, when she said this, that Marcus Doyle now worked 2 floors below that very courtroom, as a court services coordinator, having spent a decade rebuilding a life that had nearly been derailed at 16, and that he was, at that exact moment, standing at the back of the gallery, having walked in during a break to deliver paperwork, listening to a woman say his name for the first time in 3 decades. Renata, the prosecutor, had been watching the exchange with the particular stillness of someone recalculating her own position. She had joined the DA's office 6 years earlier believing, as most young prosecutors do, that the system worked more often than it failed. She had grown quietly uneasy over those 6 years watching cases move through Preston's office and others like it, watching pleas get signed by defendants who had barely met their own attorneys, watching herself win cases she suspected she should not have won so easily. She had never said this aloud, because a prosecutor who says such things aloud is generally not a prosecutor for very long. She said, when Whitfield turned to her for the state's position, that the state had no objection to Judge Ashby's request to address the court, and that the state would, in fact, welcome a continuance to review the file more carefully itself. It was the first time in 6 years Renata had said something like that in open court. Whitfield noted it. He noted, too, that his own courtroom had processed 412 cases in the last calendar year, an average of 11 minutes per hearing when plea deals were involved, a number he had never actually calculated until Corrine's audit put it in front of him in black and white. He had believed, the way Preston once believed, that his courtroom moved quickly because the system was efficient. He was beginning to understand that it moved quickly because no one had been made to sit with how fast it actually was. Corinne turned to the specific facts of her grandson's file. The arresting officer's report described a suspect 5 inches taller than her grandson, wearing a jacket her grandson did not own, at a time her grandson's phone records, which she had already subpoenaed independently through her own attorney of record, placed him 4 miles away. The plea agreement on the table, which Preston had drafted from a template 2 nights earlier between 2 other case preparations, waived a suppression hearing that any attorney with time to read the file would have requested as a matter of course. She was not asking the court to dismiss the charges outright. She was asking for time, a continuance of no less than 30 days, a full evidentiary review, and a formal referral of the courtroom's caseload data to the State Bar's Oversight Committee, the same committee she had once, in a different life, testified before as a sitting federal judge. Whitfield granted the continuance without hesitation. He ordered the suppression hearing. He requested, separately and on his own initiative, that the county bar's staffing audit be entered as an exhibit in a wholly unrelated administrative proceeding scheduled for the following month, concerning the public defender's office budget request currently stalled before the county commission. It was the first time in his 4 years on the bench that Whitfield had used his own authority to push an institutional problem upward, rather than simply processing the case in front of him and moving to the next one. He would tell Corinne, months later, over coffee, that watching her do this in his own courtroom had reminded him why he had wanted to clerk for her in the first place, and how much of that instinct he had let atrophy under the daily pressure of a full docket. Preston sat through all of it without speaking. When Whitfield finally turned to him and asked whether he had anything to add, Preston said only that he needed 30 seconds. He took them. Then he said, in a voice considerably smaller than the one he had used in the hallway 40 minutes earlier, that he owed the court, and Corinne's grandson, an apology for the pace at which this had moved, and that he had not, in fact, read the arresting officer's report in full before advising a plea. He did not make excuses. He did not mention his caseload, though everyone in the room now understood exactly what it was. Corinne watched him say this and felt something she had not expected to feel toward him, which was not vindication, but a thin, cautious thread of respect. A man who could not admit fault would have been a much harder problem to fix than a man who was simply drowning and had never been asked by anyone above him to say so out loud. At the back of the gallery, Marcus Doyle set down the paperwork he had been carrying and did not leave the room. Corinne did not see Marcus at first. She was gathering her folder, and Whitfield was setting the continuance date, and Preston was still sitting with the file open in his hands as though seeing it clearly for the first time. It was Renata who noticed him standing at the back, motionless, paperwork forgotten at his side, and who followed his eyes to the woman in the cardigan, folding her glasses closed. Renata did not know who he was. She only knew that a grown man in a courthouse polo shirt was looking at a retired federal judge, the way people look at something they had believed, for a very long time, they would never see again. Corinne turned, and their eyes met across the gallery, and for a moment neither of them moved. She had described him in the record 11 minutes earlier as a 16-year-old boy. He was now 46. He had a courthouse identification badge clipped to his belt, court services coordinator, 5 years in the role, a job he had gotten after a decade of work that had involved considerably more failure than the version of the story anyone would ever put on a plaque. Corinne said his name again, quietly this time, not for the record, just for him. Marcus. He nodded. He said Judge Ashby in a voice that cracked slightly on the second syllable, and then he did something neither of them expected, which was that he crossed the gallery and sat down beside her, and for nearly a minute neither of them said anything else at all. What Corinne did not know, because she had lost track of him after his release in 1996, was the shape of the decade that followed his plea. 18 months had become, in practice, considerably more than 18 months, because a felony conviction at 17 had followed him into every job application, every apartment lease, every attempt to enroll in a community college course that required a background checkbox he could not check honestly, and did not know how to explain. He had worked construction under the table for 6 years. He had been arrested twice more, both times for minor infractions that would likely never have escalated to arrest at all if he had not already been carrying a record that made every officer who ran his name treat him as a known quantity rather than a person having a bad day. He had, at 28, spent 4 months in county lockup for a parole violation that amounted to missing a check-in appointment, because his bus route had changed, and no one had told him. It was during that 4-month stretch that something had shifted. A public defender named Alicia Farrow, 23 years into a career that had somehow not burned her out the way it burned out most people who lasted that long, had taken his case not because it was interesting, but because she happened to have, that particular month, a caseload of only 40, a rarity she attributed to nothing more than good timing and an unusually thin docket. She had spent 6 hours with him, not 11 minutes, and in the course of those 6 hours she had asked him what he actually wanted to do with his life if the record stopped following him everywhere. He had told her, almost as a joke, that he used to think about being a lawyer, back when he was a kid who thought a courtroom was where wrongs got fixed instead of processed. Alicia had not laughed. She had told him about record expungement statutes he had never known existed, had filed the petitions herself on her own time, and had gotten his juvenile conviction from 1994 sealed within the year. Marcus had not become a lawyer. He had become, instead, someone who worked inside the machinery of the courts every day, helping other frightened defendants understand paperwork that had once been impossible for him to understand at 16, translating court dates and probation terms and public defender assignments for people who reminded him, more often than he liked, of himself. He had never spoken publicly about any of it. He had certainly never expected to see the woman whose failure to save him 30 years earlier had, in its own strange way, set the entire second half of his life in motion, sitting 11 feet away from him on a Tuesday morning, dismantling the exact same system that had nearly finished the job her absence had started. He told her all of this in the hallway outside Courtroom 4, in the 20 minutes before the next case was called, while Corinne listened the way she had once listened to closing arguments completely, without interrupting, filing every detail away. She told him when he finished that she had thought about him more times over 30 years than she could count, that she had specifically remembered the 11 minutes his public defender had spent with him, because it was the number that had haunted her, the arithmetic of injustice reduced to something so small and so exact. She told him she was sorry, plainly, without qualification, the way she had trained herself over decades never to apologize to powerful men, and had never once trained herself out of apologizing honestly to people who deserved it. Marcus told her she had nothing to apologize for. She had been 26. She had taken his case for free when no one else would. He had simply needed the system itself to be different, not one exhausted young lawyer to somehow be superhuman inside a structure designed to grind exhausted young lawyers down. Corinne said that was precisely the problem she had spent the morning trying to name in open court, and precisely the problem she intended to spend the next several months doing something about. The county commission budget hearing was 6 weeks away. Corinne had known about it for months, had been tracking it the way she tracked every relevant hearing in the 3 counties whose staffing audits she had flagged, but had never expected to be walking into it with a case file, a judge, a prosecutor, and a court services coordinator all willing to testify to the same pattern from 4 different vantage points. She asked Marcus carefully, without pressure, whether he would be willing to speak at that hearing, not as a wronged party seeking sympathy, but as someone with 19 years of proximity to exactly what an underfunded public defender's office produced, one case at a time, for exactly the kind of people the commission rarely heard from directly. Marcus did not answer immediately. He told her he needed to think about it, because saying his own story out loud in a public forum was different from carrying it quietly for 3 decades, and she told him that was the correct response, that anyone who said yes to something like that instantly had not thought about it enough. Preston found them in the hallway 20 minutes later, having finished the next case on Whitfield's docket, a plea he had, for the first time in 11 months, taken 40 minutes to review rather than 4. He approached Corinne hesitantly, the posture of a man uncertain whether he still had standing to speak to her at all. He said he wanted her to know he had requested a meeting with his supervising attorney for that afternoon, to formally raise his caseload, something he had been telling himself for months he did not have standing to complain about, because every attorney in the office carried the same weight and complaining had felt, to him, like admitting he could not do a job everyone else was apparently managing. Corinne told him that was exactly the lie the system depended on every exhausted person in it believing simultaneously, and that the first useful thing he could do with what had happened that morning was stop believing it. The county commission met on the second Thursday of the month, in a municipal building 3 blocks from the courthouse, in a room built to hold 60 people and rarely holding more than 12. Budget hearings were not, as a rule, well attended. They ran long, they were procedurally dense, and the commissioners who sat through them had learned, over years of sparse public interest, that difficult line items could generally be tabled, deferred, or quietly folded into next year's discussion without anyone in the community noticing enough to object. This was, Corinne had come to understand through her work with the nonprofit, precisely how underfunded public defender offices survived decade after decade without correction. Not through any single villain refusing to fund them, but through the accumulated weight of nobody in the room being uncomfortable enough, on any given Thursday, to make the silence cost something. She intended to make it cost something. She arrived 40 minutes early with 3 binders, each organized the way she had once organized briefs for the federal bench, tabbed and cross-referenced, containing the original staffing audit, the caseload data specific to this county, and a set of case outcomes she had compiled quietly over 8 months showing the correlation between attorney caseload and time served by defendants who ultimately should not have been convicted at all. She had not built this case to win an argument. She had built it the way her mother had taught her to finish a seam, carefully, so that when someone eventually pulled on it looking for the flaw, they would not find one. Marcus arrived 20 minutes after her, in a suit he had bought 2 days earlier because he did not own one, sitting stiffly in the second row, a single index card of notes in his hand that he had rewritten 4 times the night before. He had told his wife, the previous evening, that he did not know if he could do this, standing in a public room and describing what an 11-minute conversation with a stranger had cost him at 16. She had told him that the version of himself who had spent a decade rebuilding a life from that 11 minutes was exactly the version of himself qualified to describe it, and that qualification was not the same thing as comfort. Renata arrived last, and alone, having told no one in the district attorney's office that she intended to speak. She had spent the 6 weeks since the arraignment reviewing, on her own time, 40 of her own closed cases from the previous 18 months, cross-referencing which defense attorneys had carried caseloads above the audit's 60-case threshold at the time of each plea. 31 of the 40 had been represented by attorneys over that threshold. She had not told her supervisor she was doing this review. She understood, sitting in the commission room with her own findings folded in her lap, that speaking today might complicate her standing in an office that generally preferred prosecutors who did not examine, too closely, the conditions under which their convictions were obtained. The chair of the commission, a soft-spoken man named Harlan Voss, who had held the seat for 11 years, and had, in that time, developed the specific skill of moving contentious agenda items along without appearing to rush them, called the public defender's budget request as Item 6 of 9. He noted, for the record, that the request represented an 18% increase over the previous year, a number that had already drawn a raised eyebrow from Commissioner Reyes, the newest member of the board, who had campaigned 18 months earlier on fiscal restraint, and had not yet had occasion to test what that phrase actually meant when it collided with a courtroom. Corinne rose when the floor opened for public comment. She did not introduce herself by her former title, though everyone in the room who had followed local legal circles for more than a decade recognized her immediately, and a ripple of recognition moved through the handful of attorneys scattered among the audience. She stated simply that she was there to speak to the 18-month-old staffing audit commissioned by this very county, filed with this commission, and never once discussed at a public meeting in the year and a half since its submission. She read the relevant finding aloud, the 60-case threshold, the county's actual average of 131, and she watched Commissioner Reyes' expression change from polite attention to something considerably more alert. She did not stop there. She described, without nomming him, a young attorney who had entered the profession 11 months earlier believing he could do meaningful work through effort alone, who now carried nearly 2.5 times the caseload the county's own audit deemed defensible, and who had, as a direct and foreseeable consequence of that math, nearly allowed a teenager to accept a plea deal built on a description that did not match him and an alibi no one had checked. She said this was not a story about one careless young man. She said it was the mathematically inevitable output of a structure that had been flagged, in writing, 18 months earlier, and funded as though the flag had never been raised. Harlan Voss thanked her for her comments in the practiced tone of a man accustomed to thanking people before moving to the next item, and might have done exactly that, had Renata not stood immediately after, identified herself by her full title as an assistant district attorney currently assigned to this county's criminal docket, and stated that she wished to enter her own findings into the public record. The room's attention, which had begun to drift back toward the agenda, snapped fully forward. A prosecutor voluntarily testifying against the conditions that produced her own convictions was not a thing Harlan Voss had encountered in 11 years on the commission, and his practiced pivot toward item 7 stalled visibly. Renata read her numbers plainly. 31 of 40 reviewed cases, plea agreements entered by defense counsel over the audited caseload threshold. She stated she could not speak to how many of those 31 pleas might have gone differently under adequate representation, only that the number was large enough that she, as the prosecutor who had won each of those cases, no longer felt she could describe the process that produced them as functioning correctly. Commissioner Reyes asked her directly whether she was suggesting the county was currently obtaining convictions it should not be confident in. Renata said she was suggesting exactly that, and that she would rather say it in this room than continue reading about it in a report nobody discussed. Marcus rose last. He introduced himself only as a court services coordinator, 30 years removed from a juvenile case in this same county that had been resolved in 11 minutes of attorney consultation, a plea he had accepted at 16 that had cost him, by his own accounting, roughly a decade of the life he might otherwise have built. He did not ask for sympathy. He asked the commission to understand that he was not a hypothetical case study, that he was a person currently sitting in their meeting room in a suit he had bought 2 days earlier, and that the 18% increase on their agenda represented, in concrete terms, the difference between an attorney having 11 minutes or 2 hours to prevent the next version of what had happened to him. Harlan Voss called for a 10-minute recess before the vote. He did not look, when he called it, like a man simply managing an agenda anymore. The recess lasted 14 minutes, 4 longer than announced, because Harlan Voss spent most of it in a side room with the county's budget director, asking questions he had apparently never thought to ask in 11 years of approving line items without discussion. When the commission reconvened, Commissioner Reyes asked to speak first, which was itself unusual, since junior commissioners typically deferred to the chair on contested items. She said that she had come into this meeting prepared to push back on an 18% increase on fiscal grounds, and that she still believed fiscal restraint mattered. But she said she had not understood, until watching a retired federal judge, a sitting prosecutor, and a court employee describe the same structural failure from 3 different vantage points in the space of 20 minutes, that the actual fiscal question was not whether the county could afford the increase. It was whether the county could afford what it was currently paying, in wrongful convictions, appeals, and relitigated cases, to avoid it. The vote was 5-2 in favor of the increase, with a further motion, introduced by Reyes herself, directing the county to commission a follow-up audit in 12 months to confirm the funding had actually translated into reduced caseloads, rather than simply being absorbed elsewhere in the office's budget. Corinne had seen audits get funded and quietly diluted before. She had made a note, before she ever stood to speak that day, to ask for exactly this follow-up mechanism if the vote went her way, and she was gratified, though she did not show it, that a commissioner she had never met had arrived at the same safeguard independently. Preston was not in the room. He had, 3 weeks earlier, requested a formal meeting with his supervising attorney, a woman named Carol Deng who had run the office for 14 years and who had, in that time, developed the specific weariness of someone who agreed entirely with every complaint her staff brought her and had simply stopped believing she had the leverage to fix any of it. Preston told her, in that meeting, that he could not continue accepting new assignments at his current caseload, that he had nearly let an innocent teenager plead to a charge that would not have survived a suppression hearing, and that he was not raising this to protect himself from consequences, but because he believed, for the first time since his fellowship had ended, that raising it was actually his job. Carol Deng had listened, and then told him something he had not expected, which was that she had been sending the same numbers up to the county for 6 years without result, and that she did not know how to make the county listen when a woman with considerably more institutional standing than either of them had apparently found a way to do exactly that in one afternoon. The budget increase, once passed, did not fix Preston's caseload overnight. Institutional change rarely moves at the speed of a single courtroom scene, however satisfying that scene might be to witness. It took 4 months for the office to hire the additional attorneys the funding allowed, and in that time Preston continued to carry more cases than the audit recommended, though noticeably fewer than before, as Carol Deng began redistributing the heaviest files across a slightly larger staff. Preston asked during that period to be assigned as second chair on 3 cases with Denise, the senior attorney who had once been mistaken for a paralegal in her own first year, specifically so he could observe how she triaged a caseload without letting any single file go unread. He did not become, in 4 months, a different lawyer than he had been. He became, more slowly and more believably, a lawyer who had started keeping a private list, taped inside his desk drawer, of every fact he had nearly missed in every case, so that he would never again mistake a familiar assumption for an actual finding. Corinne's grandson's suppression hearing was held 5 weeks after the commission vote. The description in the arresting officer's report, once properly examined against the phone records Corinne had subpoenaed, did not hold up under cross-examination, and the charges were dismissed in full. Her grandson did not return to school the following week as though nothing had happened. He had turned 18 3 days after his arraignment, and he had spent the intervening weeks watching his grandmother do, in a public courtroom, something he had never fully understood she was capable of. He told her, the evening the charges were dismissed, that he had decided he wanted to study political science rather than the engineering program he had been planning to enter, because he had realized, watching her, that the structures underneath a room mattered more than anything that happened inside it on any given day. Corinne told him that was a fine thing to want to study, and a considerably harder thing to actually spend a career doing well, and that she would tell him, when he was ready to hear it, everything it had cost her to learn that the second half of that sentence was true. Marcus's testimony at the commission hearing did not end with him becoming some public figure or spokesman for reform, a role he had no interest in, and told Corinne plainly he would decline if ever offered it. He went back to his job as a court services coordinator the following Monday, and continued doing it, though something in how he did it had shifted. He began, without any formal authorization, keeping a private note for every defendant who came through his office looking as lost as he once had, a single line about who they reminded him of, filed away not for any official purpose, but because he had decided, 30 years too late for the version of himself who needed it, that being remembered by someone in the building mattered more than people who had never needed it tended to understand. Renata's decision to testify did complicate her standing in the district attorney's office, exactly as she had anticipated it might. Her supervisor did not fire her, because there was no clean pretext to do so, but she found herself quietly reassigned, over the following year, away from the highest-profile cases she had previously been trusted with, toward docket work considered less sensitive. She did not regret the testimony. She told Corinne, at a coffee they had 6 months later, that she had spent 6 years winning cases she was proud of in the moment and uneasy about by the time she got home, and that she would rather be sidelined for having said something true than continue advancing for having stayed quiet about something she could no longer unsee. 3 weeks before her grandson's suppression hearing, while the paperwork on his case was still moving through discovery, Corinne received a call from a woman named Priscilla Acaffer, who ran the nonprofit's regional caseload monitoring project out of a converted church basement 2 counties north. Priscilla had been tracking a different office entirely, in a rural county with a single overworked public defender covering 4 separate courthouses, and she had come across a case that she thought Corinne, given her current involvement in a live courtroom fight, ought to see before it disappeared into a plea the way so many others had. The case involved a 22-year-old woman named Danielle Reyes, no relation to the Commissioner Corinne would later encounter, a young mother of 2 facing a felony theft charge connected to a retail loss prevention dispute that had escalated over the course of 11 confused minutes inside a discount store into an arrest neither the store manager nor the responding officer seemed entirely able to explain consistently in their own written statements. Danielle had been offered a plea of 9 months, reduced from an original charge that could have carried up to 3 years, by a public defender named Walter Grum, who was 61 years old, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with a single bad month and everything to do with 28 years of a caseload that had only ever grown, and who had told Priscilla, when she came to observe his docket as part of her monitoring work, that he no longer had the capacity to feel anything in particular about any individual case, because feeling something about all of them would have made the job impossible to continue doing at all. Corinne listened to Priscilla's summary over the phone at her kitchen table, the same table where she read audits on Tuesdays, and she felt the specific, familiar chill of recognizing a pattern she had already seen once that month reproducing itself in a different building with a different name attached. She asked Priscilla to send her everything, the store's surveillance footage log, though not the footage itself, which had not yet been formally requested by Danielle's own attorney, the arrest report, and whatever plea paperwork already existed. She told Priscilla she would look at it that evening, though she suspected, even as she said it, that she already knew what she would find. What she found, reading at her kitchen table until nearly midnight, was a surveillance log indicating that footage existed showing the disputed register transaction in full. Footage that Walter Grum had never requested because requesting it required a formal motion he did not have time, in a caseload of 192 active files, to draft. Danielle had told him in their 12-minute meeting that the discrepancy was a register error, a returned item rung up incorrectly by a teenage cashier who no longer worked at the store and could not be easily located to confirm it. Walter had written this down. He had not pursued it, because pursuing it meant a continuance, and a continuance meant explaining to a judge, in a county where he appeared before the same 3 judges every single week, why yet another one of his cases needed more time than the docket was built to allow. Corinne drove 2 hours north the following Saturday to meet Danielle in person, something she had not originally planned to do, telling herself the entire drive that she was simply gathering information for the nonprofit's broader pattern documentation, though she suspected, somewhere past the county line, that she was doing something closer to what she had done for Marcus 30 years earlier, and had regretted not doing enough of ever since. Danielle met her at a diner near the courthouse, her younger child asleep in a stroller beside the booth, her older child, 6 years old, drawing carefully inside the borders of a paper placemat with a box of crayons the waitress had brought without being asked. Danielle told Corinne, in the flat, careful voice of someone who has learned not to expect much from institutions, that she had already decided to take the 9 months, because her mother could watch the children for that long, and because fighting the charge and losing would mean a longer sentence, and a mother who might come home to children who had grown considerably more used to her absence. Corinne asked her one question. She asked whether Danielle wanted to fight the charge if there was a real chance of winning, or whether she had simply concluded, from everything the system had shown her so far, that winning was not a realistic category available to someone in her position. Danielle did not answer immediately. She looked at her daughter drawing on the placemat for a long moment before she said that she had stopped, somewhere in the last year, believing that the second option and the first option were actually different things. Corinne told her they were different things, that the footage existed, that no one had simply looked at it yet, and that she was prepared to make sure someone did, if Danielle was willing to ask for 30 more days before she signed anything. Corinne did not go to Walter Grum directly, not at first. She understood from decades on the bench that an attorney carrying 192 cases was not a man who needed to be confronted, but a man who needed someone else to do a piece of the work he no longer had the hours in a week to do himself. She asked Priscilla to file the formal motion for the surveillance footage under the nonprofit's limited amicus authority, a maneuver she had used twice before in other counties, careful and procedurally clean, designed to get the footage into the record without requiring Walter to admit, in front of a judge he appeared before every week, that he had never thought to request it himself. The footage arrived 11 days later, 40 minutes of grainy overhead video from a discount store 2 towns from the courthouse, and it showed, with total clarity once someone finally sat down and watched it in full, a cashier ringing up a returned item incorrectly, exactly as Danielle had said in her 12-minute meeting with Walter months earlier, and a store manager escalating the resulting confusion into an accusation of theft, largely because the cashier in question, a teenager who had since left the job, was not present to explain her own mistake, and Danielle was the only person left in the frame to blame. Priscilla watched it twice before calling Corinne. Corinne watched it once, at her kitchen table, and felt the particular, quiet fury she had trained herself over 40 years to keep entirely out of her voice and entirely present in her work. Walter Grum was informed of the footage by the prosecuting attorney's office, not by Corinne or Priscilla directly, a deliberate choice on Corinne's part, because she understood that an overworked man confronted by outside advocates tends to become defensive in ways that slow a case down, while an overworked man, informed by the opposing side that his own client's case had just fallen apart in the state's favor, tends to move considerably faster. Walter reviewed the footage in his car in the courthouse parking lot between 2 other hearings and sat for nearly 10 minutes afterward without starting the engine. He had been a public defender for 28 years. He had entered the profession, like Preston, like nearly everyone who enters it, believing he could do meaningful work, and had watched that belief erode not all at once but case by case, plea by plea, across nearly 3 decades of caseloads that had only ever grown heavier while the courthouse added new judges and new prosecutors, and never once, in his memory, added another public defender to share the weight. He withdrew the plea offer himself, without being asked, and filed a motion to dismiss the charges entirely, which the court granted 2 weeks later once the prosecuting attorney, faced with footage that contradicted her own store manager's statement, declined to oppose it. Walter called Danielle personally to tell her, rather than having his office send the standard form letter, something he told Priscilla afterward he had not done for a client in longer than he could remember, because he had simply stopped believing, somewhere in the previous decade, that any individual outcome was worth a phone call rather than a form. Danielle did not celebrate extravagantly. She picked her children up from her mother's apartment that evening, made dinner, and put them to bed at the normal time, because she had learned, over the previous several months, not to let any single piece of good news undo the careful, exhausting discipline of getting through an ordinary day intact. She called Corinne 2 days later, though, and told her that her daughter, the 6-year-old who had been coloring on the placemat, had asked why the lady from the diner had come to see them, and that Danielle had told her the lady was someone who believed people should get looked at properly before anyone decided what happened to them. Corinne told Danielle that was, as far as she was concerned, the entire job description of everything she had ever tried to do in a courtroom, on either side of the bench. Walter Grum requested a meeting with his own supervising attorney the following week, the first such meeting he had requested in 11 years, and told her, plainly, that he could not continue at his current caseload without something changing, not because he had suddenly become unable to do the work, but because he had finally allowed himself to calculate, in the specific dollar and hours arithmetic his supervisor had never once asked him to perform aloud, exactly how many minutes he had available per case, and exactly how far short that fell of what any individual file actually required. His supervisor, like Carol Deng 2 counties south, told him she had been sending the same numbers upward for years without result. Walter asked her, for the first time in his career, whether she would be willing to let him testify alongside her the next time the county commission took up the budget, rather than simply filing another report destined to sit unread on the 14th page of an audit nobody discussed. By the time Corinne's grandson's suppression hearing arrived 5 weeks later, 2 counties, not one, were quietly moving toward the same reckoning, each unaware for a period of several weeks that the other case existed at all, until Priscilla, compiling her regional report for the nonprofit's annual review, realized she was documenting the same structural failure twice in the same season, and asked Corinne whether the 2 cases might be more powerful presented together than apart. Priscilla's idea, once she raised it, took nearly a month to arrange, because joint regional hearings were not a standard feature of how county commissions operated, and she had to work through the State Association of Counties to find a procedural mechanism that would allow 2 separate commissions to hear related testimony on the same afternoon, without either county feeling it was being lectured by the other's business. She eventually found her opening in a biannual regional infrastructure summit, a genuinely unglamorous gathering typically devoted to road maintenance budgets and shared emergency services funding, which nonetheless brought together commissioners, agency heads, and court administrators from 6 neighboring counties in a single auditorium once every 2 years. She requested, and was granted, a 20-minute slot on public defense funding, sandwiched between a presentation on bridge repair allocations and one on regional dispatch consolidation. Corinne did not think at first that 20 minutes wedged between infrastructure items would carry much weight. She had learned, though, over 4 decades in and around courtrooms, that the value of an audience rarely correlated with the size of the room, and that 6 counties, worth of commissioners and court administrators sitting in the same auditorium, even for road budgets, represented an unusually dense concentration of exactly the people who needed to hear what she and Priscilla had assembled. She agreed to attend, on the condition that this time, rather than speaking largely alone, the accounting would be shared among everyone who had lived a piece of it, Preston and Walter both, Marcus and Danielle if they were willing, and Renata, whose reassignment the previous year had not stopped her from continuing, quietly, to track her own office's plea outcomes on her own time. Preston and Walter met for the first time in the parking lot of the summit venue, 2 men separated by 3 decades and 2 counties, who nonetheless recognized something of themselves in each other within the first few minutes of conversation. Walter, 28 years into a career Preston had barely begun, told him that the thing he most regretted was not any single case, but the particular numbness that had crept in so gradually. He had never noticed the exact week he stopped being able to feel the weight of what an 11-minute consultation actually meant to the person sitting across from him. Preston told him he was terrified of becoming exactly that, and Walter told him, with the specific bluntness of a man who no longer had much patience for softening difficult truths, that the terror was the only thing currently keeping him from it, and that he should hold on to it for as long as he possibly could, because the day it stopped scaring him was the day it would already be too late. Marcus agreed to speak again, more easily this time than he had at the original commission hearing, because he had discovered, in the years since, that describing what happened to him no longer felt like reopening a wound, but like finally explaining something that had shaped the entire second half of his life in ways worth other people understanding. Danielle agreed as well, though she asked to speak briefly and specifically, without turning her case into anything larger than what it actually was, an ordinary young mother nearly convicted for a register error, because no one had the time to watch 40 minutes of footage before deciding her future. She brought no notes. She said, when her turn came, that she did not want anyone in the room to think her story was unusual, because the entire point of what had almost happened to her was that it was not unusual at all, that it was simply what happened, over and over, in a system too thin to look closely at any single person. Renata spoke last among the group, and updated her earlier findings with a fuller year of data, showing that across 2 counties now, not one, the correlation between attorney caseload and questionable plea outcomes held with a consistency that made it considerably harder for anyone in the room to dismiss as an isolated failure. She noted, without editorializing, that her own reassignment the previous year had cost her nothing she regretted, and that she would make the same choice again without hesitation. A line that drew a longer silence from the assembled commissioners than any of the numbers preceding it. Corinne spoke last of all briefly, because she had learned that the most useful thing a person with institutional standing can sometimes do is simply stand behind everyone else's testimony rather than in front of it. She said only that she had spent 19 years on a federal bench believing the system beneath her worked reasonably well, because the cases that reached her had already survived enough scrutiny to arrive there at all, and that she had needed her own retirement and her own grandson's arraignment to understand how much never survived long enough to reach any one position to notice it going wrong. The regional summit did not produce an immediate funding vote because it lacked the authority to enact one, but 3 of the 6 counties present opened their own staffing audits within the following 2 months, and the State Association of Counties, for the first time in its history, added public defender caseload standards as a standing agenda item for its annual conference. A small, unglamorous, procedural shift that Corinne understood, better than almost anyone else in that auditorium, was precisely the kind of change that actually lasted, because it did not depend on any single dramatic afternoon being remembered, but on the machinery itself being quietly, permanently altered. A year after the regional summit, Corinne drove north again, the same 2-hour route she had once driven not knowing what she would find, except this time she was not investigating a case, she was attending a graduation. Danielle had enrolled in a paralegal certificate program 8 months after her charges were dismissed, working nights at a warehouse while her mother watched the children, and she had asked Corinne, almost shyly, over a phone call in the spring, whether she would come to the small certificate ceremony held in a community college gymnasium with folding chairs and a borrowed podium. Corinne told her she would not miss it. She sat in the 3rd row between Danielle's mother and Priscilla, and when Danielle's name was called, her 6-year-old daughter, now 7, stood on her folding chair and shouted loudly enough that the entire gymnasium turned to look, and nobody asked her to sit back down. Danielle told Corinne afterward, in the parking lot, holding her certificate carefully by its edges as though it might smudge, that she had decided to specialize in exactly the kind of caseload advocacy Priscilla's nonprofit did, reviewing files for exactly the pattern that had nearly cost her a year of her children's lives. She said she did not want to be a symbol of anything either, echoing what Marcus had said a year earlier without either of them ever having compared notes, and Corinne told her that the 2 of them not wanting to be symbols was precisely what made them so effective at the actual work, because symbols get admired from a distance, and the work required people willing to stay close enough to it to keep doing it quietly, case by case, for years. Walter Grum retired 18 months after the regional summit, not abruptly or bitterly, but on his own schedule, once his county had hired 4 additional public defenders, and his own caseload had dropped low enough that he told his supervisor, with something close to wonder, that he had time that year to take a genuine vacation for the first time since 2003. He spent his retirement, somewhat to his own surprise, doing volunteer intake work 2 mornings a week at the same office he had left, not because anyone asked him to, but because he found he did not know what to do with himself, entirely disconnected from a courtroom, and preferred to spend his remaining working hours on the 2 mornings that felt manageable rather than none at all. Preston did not leave the public defender's office either, and 3 years after the arraignment that had nearly ended his confidence in himself entirely, he was promoted to a supervising role of his own, overseeing 4 newer attorneys with a caseload cap. He enforced more strictly than anyone had enforced his own caseload when he started. He kept the index card from Courtroom, the one that said never let the word busy stand in for the word unprepared, taped inside his desk drawer long after the ink had begun to fade, and he had it laminated eventually, not out of sentiment exactly, though partly that, but because he had started showing it to every new attorney who joined his team on their first day. Marcus was promoted the following year to a position overseeing court services for the entire county, and he used part of that new authority to establish a formal reentry liaison role, staffed by people who had themselves once moved through the system as defendants, reasoning that no one explained the machinery of a courthouse to a frightened person more clearly than someone who had once been exactly that frightened themselves. He never fully closed the private notebook he had started keeping the year of Corin's grandson's arraignment, the 1 line per person, who they reminded him of, though it eventually grew heavy enough that he moved it from a spiral notebook into a proper file cabinet, 1 drawer, then 2, filled with the names of people he had made sure, in whatever small way his job allowed, were not simply processed and forgotten. Renata left the district attorney's office 3 years after her testimony, not forced out, but drawn instead toward a position with the state's Public Integrity Division, reviewing exactly the kind of systemic patterns she had once tracked quietly on her own time in the margins of a job that had grown less comfortable for her the more clearly she saw it. She told Corinne, at the retirement dinner Corinne eventually threw for herself from her nonprofit work, that she considered the reassignment she had once feared the best professional decision she had never actually chosen for herself, and that she was grateful in the end for the courtroom that had forced her hand. Corinne's grandson finished his political science degree and went on, somewhat to nobody's surprise anymore, to law school, though he told his grandmother, the summer before he started, that he did not intend to spend his career in the same courtroom drama she had, because he had decided, watching her for years afterward do the unglamorous audit work nobody photographed, that the actual leverage had never been in the dramatic afternoon in Courtroom 4 at all, but in the 500-page reports read quietly at kitchen tables on Tuesdays, and he wanted to learn how to write those reports himself, properly, the way she had. On a Sunday afternoon that final spring, Corinne sat on her porch alone for a while before her grandson arrived for their weekly visit, looking out at a street she had lived on for over 30 years, thinking about her father's 41 years carrying bags for men who never learned his name, and her mother's careful stitching at a machine wedged into a kitchen too small for it, and a boy named Marcus she had failed once and finally, decades later, found her way back to help. She thought about how long some debts take to come due, and how rarely the people who owe them get the chance to actually pay. She had gotten that chance. She understood, sitting there, that most people never do, and that the difference between the people who eventually make things right and the people who simply carry the guilt of never getting the opportunity was not virtue so much as it was staying, patiently, prepared, in rooms long enough for the chance to finally arrive. Her grandson pulled into the driveway a few minutes later, home for the weekend, a stack of law school application materials under his arm, and he sat down beside her the way he had a year earlier, and asked her, as he sometimes still did, to tell him again about the morning a young lawyer told her to sit down and know her place. She told him, the way she always told it, without embellishment, because the truth, delivered calmly, had never once in her life needed embellishing to matter. He listened the way he always listened, completely, the way his mother had once listened to closing arguments, filing every detail away, and when she finished, he said the same thing he said every time, that he still couldn't believe she hadn't been afraid. She told him one more time that she hadn't been. She told him she had simply been waiting for the carelessness to reveal itself, the way it always eventually does, and that the only thing required of you in that waiting was staying in the room long enough to see it. If this story moved you, subscribe, like, comment, and tell us where you're watching from. We tell the stories of the women the world mistakes for background noise, the judges, the mothers, the daughters of porters and seamstresses who sat quietly in rooms where no one expected them to matter, and turned out to be the reason the room worked at all. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. The carelessness always shows. You just have to stay in the room long enough to see it. See you in the next video. Peace.